On the 2nd of August, 2026, Donald Trump posted a message on Truth Social telling the world to get to work, everybody, and get it done. He said he had just called off a major strike on Iran. He said a deal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz was close. Iran's own state-linked media didn't celebrate. They called it a retreat. Here's the detail that should stop you. This is not the first time Trump has said this, not the second. This is the third time in 5 months that a Hormuz deal has been described by the President of the United States as close, imminent, almost signed. In April, it was a 2-week ceasefire tied to Pakistani mediation. In May, it was a 60-day extension reported by Axios, with sourcing from inside the American government. And now, in August, it's a fresh pause, credited to Saudi Arabia with talks scheduled for the very next day. So the question isn't whether Trump said a deal is close. He clearly did. The question is why, every single time he says it, the government in London does the opposite of relaxing. Why does Westminster tighten up, convene emergency meetings, and quietly prepare its navy, precisely at the moments when Washington is telling everyone to exhale? That's what this video is actually about, not whether the deal happens, but why one of America's closest allies has learned the hard way not to believe the headline until the ships are actually moving. Let's set the frame before we go further. This war didn't start with Hormuz. It started on the 28th of February 2026, when a joint American and Israeli strike killed Iran's supreme leader. Trump told the Iranian people to take back their country. They didn't. Instead, a new Iranian leadership went underground and answered with missiles and drones, hitting American installations across the Gulf and targets in neighboring states. Somewhere inside that chaos, Iran did something that mattered more to the global economy than almost anything else in the conflict. It effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that carries roughly 1/5 of the world's seaborne oil. Here's the strategic logic you need to hold onto for the rest of this video. Hormuz is not just a shipping lane, it is a pressure valve on the entire global economy. Whoever controls the flow of ships through that 80-kilometer strip of water controls, in a very real sense, the price of energy for every country on Earth, whether or not they have a single soldier anywhere near the Gulf. That includes a country that has no border with Iran, no ships currently trapped there, and no direct stake in the military outcome. That country is Britain, and that's the paradox this video is going to unpack. We'll take this in 4 stages. First, the pattern of the deal is close and why it keeps failing. Second, what the war has already done to the British economy, whether or not the strait ever reopens. Third, why Britain's own military position makes it structurally incapable of simply waiting this out. And fourth, the deeper political trap Keir Starmer is caught inside, one that has nothing to do with Iran at all. Start with the pattern. Go back to early April. Trump gave Iran a 48-hour ultimatum to reopen the strait, threatening to destroy power plants and bridges and to unleash what he called hell. Then, at the deadline, he didn't strike. He said Pakistan's prime minister and its top military officer had asked him to hold off in exchange for a full and safe reopening of Hormuz. He got what he described as a 10-point proposal from Tehran. He called it a workable basis for negotiation. That deal never materialized into a reopened strait. Move forward to late May. This time it's Axios, reporting details from inside the American government, describing an agreement that was, in their words, close to being signed, a 60-day ceasefire extension, a reopened strait, Iran free to sell its oil, and negotiations over the nuclear program running in parallel. That deal never materialized into a reopened strait either. Now we arrive at August 2nd. Trump says he's holding off again, this time crediting requests from Tehran and, according to reporting, direct pressure from Saudi Arabia's crown prince. Talks are set for the following Monday. And once again, Iran's Fars news agency, tied to the Revolutionary Guard, frames the whole thing not as diplomacy, but as Trump backing down for a 3rd time. Here's the pattern, stated plainly. Every one of these moments follows the same shape. Trump threatens escalation. A regional or allied power intervenes. Trump announces a pause tied to an imminent deal. The deal does not arrive. The strait does not reopen. And a few weeks or months later, the cycle repeats. Why does this keep happening? Because the deal is close serves a strategic purpose for almost everyone involved, independent of whether it's actually close. For Trump, it lets him claim credit for restraint while still holding escalation in reserve. For Iran, it buys time without conceding anything concrete and lets state media frame American hesitation as weakness rather than diplomacy. For regional mediators like Saudi Arabia, it's a chance to look indispensable on the world stage. Everyone benefits from saying the deal is close. Almost no one benefits, in the short term, from actually closing it. This is the part most people miss when they watch this story unfold, headline by headline. They ask, is the deal real this time? That's the wrong question. The better question is, who gains from saying it's close, whether or not it is? Once you start asking that question, This entire 5-month cycle stops looking chaotic. It starts looking almost rational. Now hold on to that, because it explains something that otherwise looks strange. If you were Britain, watching this pattern from the outside, would you plan your energy policy around the next announcement? Or would you plan around the last 3 times the announcement turned out to be premature? Here's the detail that gets lost in all the talk of ceasefires and diplomacy. Britain doesn't need the strait to stay closed to be hurt by it. The damage happens the moment prices move, and prices have been moving since the war began. By late March, UK diesel prices had already hit their highest level since December 2022. By June, average petrol had climbed several pence a litre, diesel more, and gas prices on the UK wholesale benchmark had roughly doubled in a matter of weeks, rising from around 80 pence a therm to over 150. Keir Starmer stood in front of reporters and admitted, in plain language, that the war would rock Britain's economy. His Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, warned of months of upward pressure on inflation. Think about what that means politically. This is a government that inherited an economy already stretched thin, now facing an energy shock triggered by a war 8,000 kilometers away, over a decision it did not make and cannot control. And here's the detail that makes it sharper. Reeves was already under pressure to raise fuel duty by 5 pence a litre. The war made that political decision almost impossible to execute cleanly, at the exact moment household budgets were being squeezed from the other direction. That's why the G7 called an emergency meeting to discuss the economic fallout. Not because anyone expected Britain to fire a shot, but because oil is a single global market and a closed strait doesn't ask which country believes in the war before it raises their bills. But here's the problem. It gets more tangled than a simple oil shock. Because this war didn't just spike prices. It quietly rewired one of Britain's other major foreign policy commitments. With global oil markets under strain, the American administration temporarily eased some sanctions on Russian oil, specifically to relieve pressure on global supply. From Britain's perspective, and from Ukraine's, that was a serious problem. President Zelensky and other European leaders pushed back hard, arguing that easing sanctions on Moscow, in order to manage a crisis caused by Iran, was effectively handing the Kremlin a windfall funded by an entirely different war. Starmer found himself telling Zelensky that Britain can't lose focus on Ukraine, even as his own government was simultaneously issuing licenses, allowing imports of Russian-origin jet fuel and diesel refined in third countries like India, to avoid a domestic fuel shortage. Sit with that for a second. Britain's own energy security concerns, caused by a war in the Persian Gulf, pushed it toward quietly loosening pressure on Russia, the very country it has spent years trying to economically isolate over Ukraine. That's not a hypothetical downstream risk. That already happened. The conservative opposition called the sanctions carve-out insane. A senior figure on Starmer's own backbenches warned it risked undermining support for Ukraine. This is the part most coverage of the Hormuz deal completely leaves out. The strait doesn't have to be closed forever to permanently reshape British foreign policy. It already has. Now here's where the story gets more interesting, because it's not only about prices, it's about capability. In 2019, during an earlier flare-up with Iran, the Royal Navy escorted British-flagged tankers through Hormuz after Iranian forces seized the tanker Stena Impero. At the time, maritime security experts already warned this wasn't a sustainable long-term posture, because the Royal Navy's fleet had shrunk dramatically since the 1980s, from over 50 destroyers and frigates down to fewer than 20. That was 7 years ago. The fleet has not gotten larger since. Fast forward to this war, and Britain isn't just being asked to protect its own ships. According to reporting this spring, the Royal Navy is expected to take a leading role in a prospective multinational Hormuz coalition, tasked specifically with clearing the strait for merchant traffic, if a ceasefire ever holds long enough to attempt it. The reason Britain would lead isn't political prestige. It's a narrow technical one. British mine countermeasure capability, something the much larger American Navy is currently short on. Sea mines, along with drones, fast attack boats, and missiles, are exactly what make Hormuz so dangerous to reopen even after a ceasefire is signed. And Starmer himself has been notably blunt about this. He's cautioned that reopening the strait is not, in his words, a simple task, and that doing it properly would require a broad coalition precisely because of the narrow geography and the residual threats still sitting in the water even after any political deal. This is why Britain can't afford to simply celebrate every time Washington says a deal is close. If London treats each announcement as real and stands down its contingency planning, it risks being caught flat-footed the moment it's actually needed to send ships into a minefield with equipment nobody else in the coalition fully has. But if London always treats the announcement as premature, it burns political and financial capital, keeping ministers, energy executives, and military planners on permanent standby for a crisis that may or may not resolve on any given week. That's not indecision. That's the genuine bind. Britain is structurally positioned as the one ally who has to be technically ready to act in a conflict where the diplomatic signals are, by this point, demonstrably unreliable. Here's the layer most people miss entirely, because it has almost nothing to do with Iran. Trump has publicly criticized Starmer for not immediately granting permission for the first wave of American military action against Iran at the very start of the war. Starmer held back, then later authorized what was described as defensive use of American assets from RAF Fairford and the base at Diego Garcia. That's a prime minister trying to walk a very specific line, close enough to Washington to matter in the room, far enough from full co-belligerence to avoid owning a war his public never voted for. That's why Starmer's language, every time this subject comes up, is so carefully hedged. He tells reporters that Britain and America are working together as they always have, and in the same breath, that decisions about what's in Britain's interest are decisions for the British Prime Minister, not the American President. That's not a throwaway line. That's a Prime Minister trying to publicly separate himself from a war he's economically trapped inside, while privately still needing the alliance to function. That sounds like a government simply hedging its bets, and to a point, it is. Let's Steelman the other side of this for a moment, because it's a fair position. You could reasonably argue that Trump's team has genuine incentives to actually close this deal. Oil above $100 a barrel is deeply unpopular with American voters. Saudi Arabia has real leverage and a real interest in de-escalation, given how exposed Gulf economies are to sustained regional instability. And unlike April or May, this time multiple regional powers, not just Pakistan, appear to be pushing Tehran toward an actual agreement. It's entirely possible that the third time really is different, and that repeated failed attempts are simply what diplomacy under pressure looks like before it eventually succeeds. That's a fair case. But here's what it runs into. Iran's own state-linked media, hours after Trump's announcement, described this as a retreat, not a negotiation. There's no independent confirmation from Iranian officials that any agreement is genuinely imminent. And ships, according to reporting from inside Iran, remain stuck in the northern corridor of the strait, only able to move if Iran's own armed forces choose to allow it. None of that sounds like a deal that's close. It sounds like a country using the language of diplomacy to manage the optics of a military standoff it still controls the terms of. And this is the part most people miss. Even Israel, which fought alongside the United States at the start of this war, wasn't party to the original peace framework negotiated back in June, and according to a member of Netanyahu's own security cabinet, is simply waiting out this latest diplomatic push rather than trusting it. If one of the war's own combatants isn't convinced the deal is real, why would a government in London, watching from thousands of kilometers away, be any less skeptical? That's the structural truth underneath this entire story. Trump's announcements are not lies, exactly. They may well reflect a genuine good faith belief that a deal is close at the moment he says it. But belief and reality are not the same thing, and Britain has now watched that gap open up 3 separate times in 5 months. A government that gets burned once might call it bad luck. A government that watches the same cycle happen 3 times has no choice but to build its entire posture around the assumption that the 4th announcement could fail exactly like the first 3 did. So here's the reframe worth leaving you with. This isn't really a story about whether Iran and America can make a deal. It's a story about what happens to a country's economy and its military planning when it becomes permanently dependent on the credibility of someone else's announcements. Britain isn't waiting to see if the Strait of Hormuz reopens. Britain is living inside the gap between close and done, and that gap has already cost it billions in energy costs, forced an uncomfortable compromise on Russian sanctions, and stretched a shrunken navy toward a mission it may not have the ships to sustain. The deal might genuinely happen next week, or it might be the 4th false dawn in a story that's already had 3. Either way, Britain has already learned the lesson. Don't plan around the announcement, plan around the water. Here's what to watch next. Watch whether Monday's talks in Washington produce anything more concrete than another Truth Social post, a signed document, not just a promise. Watch the UK's fuel duty decision this autumn, because that single tax choice will tell you how much room Reeves actually has left after months of energy-driven inflation. And watch whether the Royal Navy receives any funding or personnel commitment tied to that proposed Hormuz coalition, because that, more than any diplomatic statement, will tell you whether Britain believes this war is closer to its end or only to its next escalation. Central thesis. Since February 2026, Donald Trump has announced 3 separate times that a deal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz is close, in April, May, and August, and each time the strait has stayed effectively closed. Britain, despite having no direct military stake in the underlying conflict, has already suffered concrete economic and strategic damage from the war, regardless of whether any ceasefire holds, including fuel and gas price spikes, an uncomfortable partial easing of Russian oil sanctions that strained relations with Ukraine, and a structural military bind, in which a shrunken Royal Navy is expected to lead any future coalition effort to clear the Strait of Mines, while its own prime minister tries to stay close enough to Washington to matter without owning a war his public never chose. The video argues that Britain's caution isn't stubbornness, it's the rational response of a country that has watched the gap between the deal is close and an actual reopened strait fail to close 3 times in 5 months.